Hello there, Jim Pinkerton. How are you?
I'm fine, thanks, Glenn Loury.
Yes, indeed, I am Glenn Loury, professor of economics at Brown University, and actually I'm in sunny New York City. I'm visiting at Columbia University this year.
Oh, okay, I got you.
So that's me.
And I'm here in Washington D.C. I'm a fellow at the New America Foundation and a contributor to the Fox News Channel.
And the Fox News channel.
The dreaded Fox News Channel.
Yeah. I've been missing your reports. I'm embarrassed to confess, Jim. But what's your?
I'm sure everybody but you at Columbia and Brown watches Fox. I have no doubt. And
well, I got Fox on my cable box. I'll check them out from time to time. You know.
So what are you teaching at Columbia this semester, quarter, whatever it is?
Well, luckily I'm not teaching anything this semester. I'm on sabbatical leave from Brown, and I've got a little bit of a break from teaching this term. So I'm staring at the blank screen here, trying to figure out, what I'm supposed to be writing or doing with my time. In the spring, I will teach an undergraduate course on inequality and race in American society, and I'll also teach, along with two other colleagues, a course for the first-year PhD students here at Columbia on roughly big ideas in economics.
Wow. Okay.
The theory is that the technical curriculum in economics graduate education is very intense, and there's never any time to sort of stand back and ask the question, what is it for? What's it all about? How does it relate to life? And so they've concocted this course here, and I'm actually all in favor of it.
So are you going to bring up the work of your fellow, that great Columbia graduate, Alexander Hamilton?
Alexander Hamilton is a graduate of Columbia. I didn't know that. I knew he was a New Yorker.
Yeah. I think it was called King's College when he was there, but it's the same place.
No, I hadn't planned on it, but now that you mention it, the founding fathers are perfectly good source of stimulation.
Hamilton, who I'm a big fan of, was really sort of, the Hamiltonianism defined as industrial policy, internal improvements, was sort of the dominant economic philosophy of this country for about the first 180 years of our history. It kind of fell away in the 70s. But, if you think about what the problem with the two parties now is, all the Republicans can think about is tax cuts, and all the Democrats can think about is sort of, basket weaving and cap and trade. And so there's this sort of the industrial idea of genuine, tangible, nuts and bolts economic development has kind of fallen out of the discourse. It's either tax cuts or BS. And the country is left with everything being made in China and 10% unemployment. So maybe something.
And the solution to that is what exactly?
I think it's industrial development, as in factories, as in.
You mean raising taxes and using public money to encourage that, or
running a debt to encourage it? But the point is, but some way or another, what happened with Obama's stimulus was it didn't stimulate anything. They didn't. If Obama had taken $800 billion and said we're going to build 10 new industries with this and 100 nuclear power plants, and electricity is going to be free or whatever it would be, as a way of encouraging economic activity and industrial production in this country as opposed to China, he'd be a much different president right now.
He would be. They would have taken that as proof of his socialism. No?
Well, they took it as proof. They took the stimulus as proof of his socialism. But the point is,
I think so. If he was going to get labeled a socialist, he might as well actually try to do something.
Exactly, do something that actually creates jobs on the ground. Instead, when you read these statistics, like 1/3 of the wind turbine stimulus money went to China, and the 2/3 of the green energy overall went overseas. You realize just how ill-equipped America's industrial base was to be stimulated because the money, there just wasn't anybody who in this country knew how to make the stuff that was wanted, and so it went overseas, but stimulated China and Germany.
Wind turbines is an interesting case. You may have seen this story in the Times. I don't know, less than a week ago, I think, on Changsha, the city of Changsha in China, which is a center for green wind turbine and solar panel production, and the massive public investments that the Chinese government, in this case local government, is making in promoting these industrial developments, and how the Chinese are pretty far advanced toward, well, cornering the market would be too strong, but achieving a dominant position in the global market for wind turbine and solar panel manufacture, in part because of these subsidies, which the World Trade Organization is looking into, since they may be in violation of, rules against subsidizing industries. But I say that only to say, evidently, the Chinese understand the importance of public investments in industrial infrastructure, and are doing it in a big way in this particular area.
Right. Well, there's lots of ways. There's lots of ways to do it. You can do it with tariffs and trade promotion and so on. But the Chinese, like every country that did develop, did it through some kind of conscious husbanding of its factories and industries, whether it's the U.S. in the 19th century, or Germany in the 19th century, or Japan and Korea. Another article, or China, just reading a couple days ago in the Wall Street Journal, I think it was, you're welcome to build an auto factory in China. That's great. But of course, we want 51% ownership and access to all your intellectual property. And and that's a pretty good plan too from China's point of view. And so who would be surprised in the least if the Chinese don't wind up in charge of the renewable industries of the future? And again, it's the kind of thing that every American understood until the 1970s, when I think on the left the Greens kind of killed off big production, and on the right the Libertarians kind of killed off any thought that the government could do anything. And then maybe the general incompetence of the government sort of vindicated both the Libertarian and Green position. And so here we are now, and I was just in the Midwest, where unemployment is 10, 11, 12%, and all the factories are being closed down, and the factories that are remaining are being severely downsized. Harley Davidson, iconic industrial name from Wisconsin, just signed a new deal with its workers, saying that look, maybe you'll keep your jobs, but we're having a 7-year pay freeze. Paying higher costs for healthcare, your own healthcare costs. We're going to bring in some temps. We're going to bring in a second tier of lower paid workers. And by the way, none of this is in writing. I mean, we could move the entire plant to China tomorrow, no matter what we just agreed to. Obviously, that's in America where $20 an hour jobs become $10 an hour jobs or less, is among other things a weak player in the international economy.
Well, there are a lot of pieces to this puzzle. I mean, labor relations is one of them. Pension costs, healthcare costs, our flagging educational system. It just seems like we're taking hits on multiple fronts in the global competitive game.
True. Although it's important to understand. I think this is something that education is great. And I want everybody to, get a good education and so on. But, 60 or 70% of the jobs in this country are non-traded services. In other words, the waitress, the
lab technician,
the school teacher, lab technician. These jobs couldn't be outsourced to China or India, no matter what you did. I mean, they're just people who, clerks and salesmen and everything like that. They're here, so their wages really aren't affected by the global economy, which means that what they really need is a skill in doing their job. They don't need to compete with China and 5 million Westinghouse or Intel scholars and stuff like that. They just need to have a decent wage doing what they do. And so I've kind of gotten suspicion over the years as I've listened to this argument of education that it's sort of a plot by school teachers to simply guarantee that as many as possible are hired to teach, the high school and so on, or college, and and then put everybody through 2 years of college and like that. When the real point is, what 75 or 80% of the people in this country need is just a decent job right in front of them, without spending well into their 20s in school.
There could be some pushback on that. I'm not an advocate of the educational establishment. I'll just observe that most of the reforms that people are talking about in the educational area are not exactly teacher friendly. I don't know that many people who think the solution to education is to hire more teachers. They think, though, that holding teachers accountable and being able to promote and reward those who do a good job is a good thing. But a conspiracy to pad the payroll of the teachers, I don't know.
Well,
but your point about whether or not education is a magic bullet, I'm inclined to agree with that, even though I think the studies do show that a pretty high rate of return to monies, and as best you can measure it, invested in quote human capital. So where does that return come from? If you're right to say that greater education doesn't really do anything for people.
Well, if your job is working at a Starbucks, then does it really matter whether you went to college?
Yeah. Okay.
Okay. So, in other words, I mean, look, obviously, for everybody.
But if you go to college, you don't have to work in Starbucks.
True,
so
true. But then there's okay, and then there's two
then
choices.
Somebody else has to work in Starbucks.
Or we got three choices then. If you get promoted out of Starbucks and you're now doing something else, which is great, we all want upward mobility. Then we got to think to ourselves: are we going to automate the Starbucks? Are we going to
Sure.
bring in foreign labor to work at the Starbucks, or
Sure.
are we going to somehow sort of enrich the experience of the unemployed? And get them off the streets and get them into jobs and stuff like that. But then the skills they need to go from being the lumpen proletariat isn't really education. It's simply punctuality and a good attitude. I mean, so I think there's just a little bit of a mismatch between the idea that we're all going to be doing high-tech jobs to compete with the Chinese, when in fact, we can see abundantly there's severe mismatches in the labor force in this country right now that have very little to do with education and a lot to do with a lot of other things.
There's definitely something to what you say, especially about the non-cognitive but behaviorally significant qualities that low-end employers are looking for in their employees. They want somebody who's going to show up, who's going to take instruction without talking back, who's not going to pilfer the stocks, and so on and so forth. And indeed, there's a sociologist at UCLA, Roger Waldinger, who has done an extensive study of low-skilled labor markets in Los Angeles and in New York City. And with respect to Los Angeles especially, he argues that, he says, if you say employers want greater skills, how come all these unskilled immigrants are getting so many jobs? The issue here is not that they need to be able to solve differential equations in their head. The issue here is that the employer wants somebody who's going to show up on time, and et cetera, et cetera. So that's certainly true. But my model would be, you educate indigenous labor, they go for higher-end jobs, and you import unskilled labor at the margin to take care of the jobs that might need filling that are less demanding in terms of human capital and specific education-related skills. I don't see anything wrong with that. I mean, I wouldn't mind seeing a country with 350 million people in it here, where the 50 million addition at the margin came from wherever. If we were, able to compete effectively with the Chinese in these industries.
I think that would be fine. The question is, I think that the U.S. population now is at 307, I think it is. We're not that far from 350. My question would be, are we going to push the unemployment rate for people who live here already down below 9.6, as it currently is, before we bring in the next 20, 30 million people? If we are, which I think is the way to do it myself, I would rather focus on getting people who already live here jobs than worry about the next tranche of immigrants. I think it's sort of time for a sort of timeout on immigration until we can figure out exactly the issues you talked about. And this Professor Waldinger at UCLA, I think, has got exactly the right idea. It's sort of a hustle if our plan is to leave the bottom 20% of our country out of a job or out of the workforce, or or in prison or whatever it is, and then say, oh, by the way, here's a new class of people who form some sort of how to say it, sort of middleware function between the elite and the lumpen. I think that's sort of makes it too easy on Americans in terms of their duty to each other to say, well, you didn't make the cut, so we're going to bring in somebody from 5,000 miles away to do your job, or do the job you might have worked your way up to.
Yeah, that argument interests me a lot, in part because, of course, a lot of this lumping that you're talking about are African American in the center of our great cities. People who are lagging behind. And I'm here in Northwest Manhattan. I'm living this year in Harlem, and I'm looking around at what's going on. And, public housing projects and a large number of people who are in and out of prison and, general sort of depressed personal development for large numbers of Americans. And, it's a political question to me when we talk about immigration, and at the same time we're interested in, doing something about that problem of Americans left behind. Interesting political problem, especially for African American leaders. On one hand, progressive politics dictates a certain position on immigration. On the other hand, the material condition of their constituents might actually be undermined to some degree by their competition with immigrants at the low end of the labor market. And I really think we need a more nuanced, a more kind of sophisticated view. That is, we advocates of the interest of African Americans, people who are concerned about blacks at the bottom of American society, need a more nuanced view on the immigration question.
Yeah, I'm sort of mystified why it isn't. I am. How could a current day progressive say? Arianna Huffington has this new book on third world America. It's like that. Well, if you import the third world, you can't help but get the third world. There's this country has a limited and its capacity to upgrade the material condition of the rest of the world, and I do mean limited. But it's just meanwhile we've clearly made a choice that you watch old movies and the service economy in an old movie, Hollywood movies in the 30s and 40s is black. It's domestic servants, it's sleeping car porters and whatever. And we all know what's happened to that group of African Americans substantially in the last 50 years. They've been replaced by Hispanics. And I don't really see how that's good for African Americans. But maybe I'm not progressive enough to quite get it.
It seems like it's a complicated problem. One of the issues, of course, is that these jobs, African Americans don't want to do. Waldinger makes this point in his work. Employers are looking for passivity. They're looking for people who are going to work 12 hours a day for low wages. They're looking for people who are prepared to work their fingers literally to the bone, whether it's, preparing chickens for the market. I was just in Arkansas, Northwest Arkansas, Fayetteville at the University of Arkansas giving a lecture, and I learned that they have a burgeoning Hispanic population in that state, even though there are tons and tons of low-income African Americans living, especially in the Delta region of the state. And the Hispanics are coming to work for Tyson chicken processing and other such agricultural work that Americans, black or otherwise, won't do. And Waldinger points out that there's this cultural thing. You're a part of the society, multi-generation, everybody's watching the same television shows. You have certain expectations about what life is supposed to bring. And, working 50, 60 hours a week for $5 an hour where your fingers are bloody when you're done is not one of the things that people who are Americans by birth expect to do. So, it's kind of hard. Those jobs are there. They need to be done. But it's kind of hard to see how you would just shift large numbers of our indigenous poor into those positions because they won't take it. And you may argue they should take it.
No,
I
would argue that they shouldn't. We shouldn't allow $5 an hour jobs.
I thought you were a libertarian.
Yeah, I'm sort of a Hamiltonian. That's why.
Oh, okay. Sorry.
I'm a sort of a big government libertarian. How's that? I just think that it was one of the achievements of the progressive era 100 years ago to basically limit things to a 40-hour week and to set some sort of minimum wage. But again, you can't have that if you've got an unlimited flood of labor coming from across the border. Look, Tyson's Chicken to name a name. Again, from their point of view, it makes perfect sense to pay as little as possible and to scour the world looking for uncomplaining, dutiful labor at whatever wage they think they can get away with, and that's their interest. But the rest of us have an interest and social peace and a broad middle class and so on. In which case, I mean, I think that the beginning of a change in the life prospects for a black person on the Arkansas side of the Mississippi Delta would be if those jobs were $15 an hour and 40-hour weeks. Or alternatively, if Tyson's and the government said, look, we're going to automate chicken plucking just like we've automated just about everything else in this country. No, we never bothered to automate chickens and chicken processing like a lot of farm work because we didn't have to. Because labor was cheap, if labor was expensive, then we'd been enforced to, but we never bothered. And so either we're going to automate chickens, which means to say that Tyson's would then have very, very few employees, but it would be extremely profitable, or we're going to pay a lot more and then just pay more for chicken, which I think I could survive, and so could most Americans, frankly.
Well, that's pretty interesting because the main mechanism for achieving the end you just described historically has been unionization. It's been workers organizing and threatening to withhold their services unless they can get a better bargain from the employers. And politically, I had thought that that was that was a bad thing to be talking about. Strengthening unions and increasing the weight that workers bring into the bargaining table when they're facing management. But that's what you're advocating.
I'm really advocating is tight labor markets. Look, we can go back and forth on unions, and I certainly don't have a problem with the idea of a union or a collective bargaining and so on like that. Yeah. But it's clear, and this is what I mean: the UAW and the steelworkers and the IAM, the machinists. These are big unions, big and powerful unions. And they were destroyed by, open labor markets and outsourcing. And so they had every idea that you just said about, being tough and so on, but they were clearly kind of outvoted, outmuscled by the threat. Okay, fine, we'll move the plant to China. So what's needed is some kind of plan for saying that, look, to Harley Davidson or Tyson's Chicken or whoever, even if you're paying high wages, like they do in Germany, the productivity of workers in America is so great. The productivity of the American system is so great. Inputs like electricity are so cheap, and you're not being harassed by trial lawyers and NIMBYs all the time. That there's something going on here in America that makes you want to build Harley Davidson motorcycles here and pay your workers $20 or $30 an hour. Again, I think this is where the progressive movement's got to rethink. Look, what do we want? Do we want a multicultural rainbow society representing the entire world, or do we want high wages for the middle class? I'm convinced, and my evidence for this is people like Michael Kazin, the left of center professor at Georgetown University, who among others who made exactly this point. Look, the progressive movement these days doesn't seem to worry very much about the middle class. The former backbone of the working class, the former backbone of progressivism, has now lost its place compared to polar bears and gay marriage and so on. And the middle class has paid a huge price because who you can't really trust hedge funders on the other side to look out for them either.
Let's talk about something else. We can talk about the economics until the cows come home here, but there are other interesting things going on. Forbes magazine cover story recently drew the fire from the White House. Dinesh D'Souza, the conservative intellectual, is attacking or describing the president in ways that Forbes puts it on its cover. And Robert Gibbs comes out and denounces this, and in the blogosphere, words like yellow journalism and screed and such are being thrown about. What do you make of all of this?
Well, I read the piece. I think that I'm sorry.
I said so did I.
I think that
we both read the piece.
Right. D'Souza's argument rests substantially on what his late father, Obama's late father, who died in 1982, wrote. And the presumption being that Obama would be affected by that. Now, there's plenty of kids, especially whose fathers died 30 years ago, who don't spend their time thinking about what their father wrote and so on. On the other hand, Obama wrote a whole book called "Dreams from My Father,"
which D'Souza discusses at length.
He does, and which then make it. I mean, I think it's an open question as to what Obama really thinks, and in his heart of hearts. And I think his presidency has been kind of a scandal of sort of being a stooge for Wall Street and Larry Summers and so on like that. But I think that's why, again, we just, not to go back to the economic stuff, that's what's happened to this country, is that Obama simply continued the trends that were so evident over the last couple decades. But there's another question which D'Souza is perfectly free to explore, which is what Obama thinks in his heart of hearts. And I don't know the answer to that. I think that the evidence in the White House that Obama is some kind of third world liberationist is extremely thin. We'll stop there. Extremely thin. But there are vast chunks of Obama's life that nobody seems to be very interested in, like what he was doing at Columbia University in the 80s and so on, and transcripts and papers and things like that. None of this stuff seems to be available. So I sort of think that D'Souza's on to something in terms of what Obama thought when he was a young man, what he wrote and what he said and what he did with the Alinsky-ites in Chicago and so on like that. But then that doesn't answer the question of how does it operationalize?
Okay, so I think a couple of things. I mean, first of all, I don't have anything good to say about Dinesh D'Souza as a journalist. I don't respect him, and this goes back a long way. When he published a book about race in the mid-1990s, The End of Racism, he and I were both fellows at the American Enterprise Institute, conservative think tank in Washington, D.C., as you know, and I read that book really quite carefully and was appalled by the low quality, in my opinion, of intellectual work that was reflected in that book, and also by the bombastic and the kind of sort of attention-grabbing and intentionally inflammatory rhetoric that that was being used, the undignified way in which the subject was being discussed, and so forth. And so that about Mr. D'Souza, and I see some of the same qualities in the article. I mean, the little innuendo and the kind of overreach and so on. I'm not going to go over a sort of factual, recitation of everything I think might not be right in that article. I'm just going to say I don't respect D'Souza as a journalist. Having said that, the question of what interested me most about it was that a major business publication in the United States could put on its cover an article, the subject of which is, who is the president really? Okay? And that interested me because evidently a great many Americans think they don't know the answer to that question. And that interests me because in a way, it seems to me that is at least partly the doing of the president himself, that is, of the process by which Mr. Obama has come to be president, and how he exploited, made good use of, for his ends, the celebrity that attended his rise from obscurity after that speech in 2004, being elected to the Senate, and then mounting a presidential campaign. And he did that. I mean, I remember in the early days of Obama's ascendancy, and all these articles were being written about, who was the president, who the presidential candidate, what does he think, where is he coming from, and so on. That people were writing, well, we've gone around and we've interviewed everybody who knew Obama from the time he was this year or that, and we can't find anybody who can tell us what he actually thinks about this or that, because, he had been circumspect and sort of, rounded off the sharp edges and had cultivated a kind of, somewhat ill-defined or, vague persona in order to be, as it were, as many things to as many people as he could possibly be. And one could develop this argument. I mean, people don't know about his religion, but then there is the sort of obscurity or lack of clarity about his relationship to the church that he actually belonged to for so many years, and so on. And I, ideologically, socialist and all of this, and I agree with you that when you look at the facts on the ground, it suggests anything but a socialist. On the other hand, the president did abjure ideological sharp edges in his campaign for the presidency. He wanted to be able to say some good things about Ronald Reagan, and you wanted not to be your conventional Democrat and so on. So I don't know what all that sums up to, except he's got one hell of a problem. It seems to me.
Right.
He's got a hell of a problem.
I agree. I think he does. I think part of it was, I've never met the man, and so don't claim any great insight. But what I've heard from people who do know him pretty well is that what really interested him when he became president in 2009 was the opportunity to sort of do a Nixon Goes to China on Islam, which strikes me as a terrific idea. We could use some of that in terms of getting along and not blowing each other up and settling all these wars and so on. So therefore, this argument runs. He just played it a little too cute, in terms of not playing up as being a Christian, not playing up as being an American, and sort of talking a little bit too much like, future Secretary General of the United Nations and Nobel Prize Peace winner, and, as it were, kind of forgetting his base. His base is America, and his base is, a country that it's the U.S. that's 90% Christian or whatever it is, and therefore that left a kind of vacuum for his enemies to say, what I would say are scurrilous things about him, but they didn't really push back hard enough, people like D'Souza can enter into that space and dig up an article which I'd never heard of. The problem. I mean, the title of that article that mentions problems of East East African socialism or communism from like 1965.
This is the article of Obama's father.
Yeah, an article written by Obama's.
Yeah.
Yeah, and again, it was 1965. Obama was 4 years old, and I think Obama met his father a grand total of once in his life. Yeah. But we just don't. We just don't know. And again, this goes to the question of, we just don't know what Obama was thinking, and as a young man in college and so on like that. And again, if everything about a president, dog and family and what they eat for lunch, and, what the place settings are at the state dinner and so on. If all that is of extreme interest to the American people, then years and years and years of Obama biography ought to be of interest as well. And it'll be interesting to see what others will make of this in terms of saying, well, we know for a fact that he never thought like this, because I sort of suspect he did in the 70s and the 80s.
Yeah, Okay. And let me just set to the side for the moment the scurrilous character of this guilt by association move that D'Souza is making, because I really do think it's yellow journalism. I mean, I just don't think respectable public discourse ought to be conducted in that way. Your father was this, therefore. Well, therefore what? On the other hand, as you say, the candidate, there's a certain amount of opacity. I mean, a kind of, we can't quite see what was going on, and we don't know. And maybe there's also some responsibility to the press for, during the campaign, having not taken up these questions as seriously as they might have done, out of maybe a desire in many in the press to protect the president, or a distaste of many in the press for the politics of the people who were trying to make a big deal out of William Ayers or Jeremiah Wright, whatever it might be. On the other hand, I want to say this. There's nothing wrong with anti-colonialism. That was the correct historical position. I mean, it's not just a peculiarity of a Luo tribesman from Kenya who happens to have gotten a scholarship to study economics in the United States to observe that the structure of political, military, and economic relations between the European dominant powers and the countries of the so-called Third World was problematic in the extreme and inconsistent with the self-determination and the liberty of those peoples of the Third World. To wit, wars of liberation from the end of World War II until the 1970s were being fought to change the facts on the ground throughout Asia and Africa. What was the Algerian war about? What was the Vietnamese war about? If it wasn't about a anti-colonial movement amongst people of the Third World to try to seize control of their own destinies away from dominant European powers. And what was wrong with any of that? So this to me is a very deep problem, because if you rest your critique of D'Souza's article on the view that he's not a fair-minded journalist and he plays dirty pool, then you're tacitly accepting this basic claim that to have had an anti-colonialist position or to have been influenced by one is somehow discrediting in American politics, when in fact, it seems to me, the correct reading of world history would leave thoughtful people in a position of having precisely such a skepticism about colonialism.
Well, I'm an anti-colonialist. I can remember reading
that's good.
J.A. Hobson, in like 1902, fierce non-Marxist, and that's an important point I'll come back to, critic of colonialism. And I was a dove on Vietnam. I was anti-Iraq war. I was basically anti-Afghan war, and so on and so on. I fully understand the history of Algeria, and and for that matter, the Jomo Kenyatta in Kenya, and so on. I mean, it's a horrible history, and there's nothing wrong with being anti-colonial and being pro-independence and everything else. However, again, there was I would call it an overinterpretation of colonialism led by the Marxists that left Americans and Europeans with kind of a dopey left-wing communism ideology, best seen in college campuses for the last 50 years, and a kind of knee-jerk Chomskyism that whatever America does is evil. That's bad enough, but we can survive that. What was seemingly paralyzing to big chunks of the third world was that the same Marxism, the same European import, infected the minds of many, if not most, of their leaders. And they said, okay, let's be communists here in China. Let's be communists here in various parts of Africa. Let's be communists in Cuba, and that's been a real catastrophe. And so,
of course, it is.
Right. So
people quote in the third world, close quote, recognize that very clearly. Not least China.
Well, not least China.
History, the wheel has turned on that. I agree with everything you said about the over-interpretation, about the adoption of Marxism, and about the debilitating effect that way of thinking had on economic development throughout the developing world. I agree with that completely.
Okay, and I'll even say this. I imagine that, again, never met him. I think Obama probably agrees with that too. But this is just still look. I don't think that the D'Souza article, I don't think the headline was, which I don't have in front of me, was something pretty strong, like how Obama thinks, or why. Maybe it's even stronger. Like Obama. He says
there's a puzzle. There's a puzzle. We can't figure out the president. There are a number of theories here. I've got the master theory. That's what the.
I don't. I mean, again, to me, the most interesting and revealing article about Obama, and I'm sure you read it too, was the one in the New Yorker. Somewhere during the 2008 campaign, it was the one that got all the attention because it had the sort of Mr. and Mrs. Obama doing a little fist bump with each other, carrying a Kalashnikov and stuff. But so the cartoon cover made it seem like more proof, or at least more allegation of extreme Patrice Lumumba radicalism. And in fact, the article was full of Hyde Park politicos and observers who said, we thought Obama was one of us, as in left, Hyde Park, Chicago is like, Berkeley, California.
I've been there.
Right. And then he gets a job at Sidley and Austin or wherever it was, and joins the suits, and he sold us out. And again, I think that explains much more of the Obama presidency when President Obama, as a fully formed adult, says, quote, and this is pretty close to a quote, I know Lloyd Blankfein of Goldman Sachs and Jamie Dimon of Morgan Stanley, and their quote, savvy, it's a famous quote now, savvy businessman. Yeah. I think we can agree that's not the way Franz Fanon would have talked.
I agree. We can agree on that.
Or probably Barack Obama Sr.
Well, that's the way a Harvard-trained, exactly. That's the way a Harvard-trained meritocrat would talk. The best and the brightest. A bunch of smart people running the world.
With a weird kind of obedience to the rich. And they've made money, so they're good. They've made money, so the fact that we gave them the money that the bonuses they pay themselves with in terms of the bailout seems to have escaped not only Obama, but a big chunk of the sort of the modern Democratic Party that doesn't.
I was ranting and raving about him putting Larry Summers in charge of the money. Not because Larry Summers is a bad economist. As far as I can tell, Larry Summers was and is a very good economist. He certainly had an impressive career. But because it revealed, in my mind, the wrong instinct. I mean, he's looking for the smartest person in the room and puts him in charge of the money. And, I thought it seemed to reveal a too much confidence in, the sort of elite structures of what Charles Murray would have called the cognitive elite. Just too much confidence in the fact that smartest people in the room get them all together. They got Nobel Prizes, or they're going to get them one day, and we'll solve the problem, because we're not George W. Bush. We're not playing from the gut. We're smart people here, and we know what's going on. And I really distrust it and distrust that instinct.
I do too, although I would add to it, again, the financial stuff. There's this whole kind of been sort of, get back to your economics course, this whole sort of dethronement of the practical, tangible economy and the enthronement of finance. There's an article in the St. Petersburg Times, somebody sent it to me this morning, about new revelations about the way that the Florida state government has been trying to run their pension funds, and it's completely bipartisan. The Democrats and Republicans, in the governorship and all across state government, were the co-managers of the Florida State Pension Fund, and they were all promising. I don't have the details in front of me, but they were all promising 9% returns or 10% returns every year forever. And obviously that's just not the way the market works. The market, in the long run, the market goes up at about the same rate as GDP. And yet everybody in Florida, had the idea that they could buy, junk bonds and whatever else and beat the market forever. And then they built their sort of fiscal policy for the state government on the basis of that. And that, again, is completely a subset of cognitive elites and so on like that, but with this weird kind of financial abracadabra that obviously has blown up in our faces as a nation in the last 2 or 3 years. And to me, Summers, Geithner, and all the rest of them, and when you read, for example, Rahm Emanuel made, I think it was $18 million working for a year and a half, working for some hedge fund in Chicago.
I didn't know.
And then when you read that, like Senator Bennett of Colorado, made $13 million working for some other financial operation. When you read that Jacob Lew, who went from being Deputy Secretary of State to OMB Director, made umpty-ump money working for Citigroup, and his replacement at the State Department is a guy who made umpty-ump money for Morgan Stanley. Again, the Republican in me says that if John McCain were doing exactly these things, there'd be screaming to high heaven.
I didn't even know about Emmanuel's big payday.
It was at Wasserstein.
And you have to ask yourself, what's the value that's being added? Here a guy comes without any particular training or long experience in a profession. He's a wired guy from D.C. And you have to wonder, what is he doing that makes it worth paying him $18 or $10 million or whatever it is? And, that raises questions about how much of a free market or, how important are the discretionary decisions of government actors, which can be influenced and which turn on, FaceTime and access and, informal connections and so forth, so that people can be lavishly rewarded for being able to provide a company with informal connections and access to political decision makers. And it all sounds all very mildly corrupt.
It does, and again, it goes back again to how did we get to the point where every state government is sitting on 10, 20, 50, 100, $200 billion in pension funds? I mean, and they're then playing the market. I mean, surely there's got to be a better way to deliver pensions, which are fully deserved and justified and contractual, to the people who need them without having this float in between of all this money. I mean, the Social Security system doesn't run this way. You don't see the Social Security
trustees. It's a pay-as-you-go system. The Social Security system takes contributions from currently working people and uses those funds to reward, to follow up on it, the promises that it's made to retirees. Whereas an employee for a state pension fund, presumably contributions from wages are being put into the fund, invested, and then the proceeds from the investment will be used to pay off the pension when the time comes. And as long as you don't define the benefit to people in an unrealistic way, but you let them get whatever benefit the investments will yield, there is no alternative but to putting the savings into the market. Right?
Why couldn't it be pay as you go? Just like Social Security.
Well, it could be pay as you go, though. Okay, I suppose it could be pay as you go. I suppose the state could simply promise benefits to people and then raise whatever quote-unquote taxes are needed to deliver on those benefits for currently employed persons.
Right. I think that what we've identified is that every Washington D.C. and every state capital, and now we're kind of discovering as these revelations keep pouring out, every city hall has been sitting on some giant pension fund. That again, this happened. This the reason I know about Senator Bennett of Colorado is because the city of Denver or the Denver School Board or one of those. I'll track it down. We'll put the link up on the site. They were sold the same bill of goods. You can have quadruple rate or normal rate of return if you just do it this way. And it was Wall Street selling them junk bonds or derivatives or something, and they fell for it.
But it seems to me that I don't know about pay-as-you-go versus, investing the funds in a different way. I mean, I'm not sure how to think about what the right way to do it is, but it seems to me that the problem that you're identifying is not that they've chosen to invest the funds, it's that they have been sold or have agreed to, expectations about the returns that were unrealistic, and then they have committed themselves to paying benefits based on those expectations, which they can't actually deliver on if the market doesn't perform as it had been over. It seems to me that that's the problem.
Well, they've overpromised benefits, but I think they've also given themselves what they call in law an attractive nuisance of listen. There's all this X billions of dollars sitting.
Oh, I see. Okay.
We don't you think that Rahm Emanuel and Jim Pinkerton and Glenn Loury all ought to be consultants or fixers or whatever to this process, and that's just as corrupt as hell. And here, even if it's legal, I mean, that's important to say. I'm not accusing anybody of a crime. I'm just saying it's corrupt as hell. And then these people all wind up as multimillionaires, and then come to Washington to be politicians and political leaders. And strangely enough, the only world that they can see is their fellow world of hedge funders and pension fund managers and bond daddies and whatever else. And then, oddly enough, we get the current economy. And I don't mean just Obama. I mean the modern, 21st century economy, which is all, of course we got it. The most important thing is China and keeping our relationship with China and doing what the WTO tells us to do, even if it means, leaving the country in ruins.
Okay, on that note, I think we're going to have to leave this conversation because I got to go to the next thing. But
all right, very good.
There's a lot of grist there, Jim. I'll think it over and we can chat again.
We will do that, I'm sure. Thanks, Glenn.
All right. Take care.
Bye-bye.